Greetings, 10th graders. We are going to jump in here into the Middle Ages after the fall of Rome. So it comes a time period called the Dark Ages, also referred to as the Middle Ages or the Medieval Era. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So the beginning of the early Middle Ages comes along with the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of Northern Europe. You see new forms of government. You also have heavy Romanization, both of religion, language, laws, architecture, and government. Latin becomes the source for medieval, which is medium aevum, which in Latin means the Middle Age, and Latin becomes a language that sort of ties all these places together while simultaneously dying, which is kind of interesting. So, the early Middle Ages are also called the Dark Ages. They last from about 500 to 1000 Common Era. Scholars name this as a time when the forces of darkness, these would be barbarians, are overwhelming the forces of light, these would be the Romans. And the rise of influence of these barbarians, as Roman emperors had granted these barbarian mercenaries land within the Roman Empire. So really the barbarians who defeat the Roman Empire were trained by the Roman Empire on how to fight. And so the land that they gained in return for military service used that land to raise bigger armies and take over and eventually claim that land for themselves. And so here you can see a map of the different migrations and invasions. The pink arrow right there is the Lombards. They invade Italy. So Italy for a long time was actually called Lombardia. The Visigoths, of course, invading Italy and then keep going, and they get out here into Spain. The Franks move into this area, and it ends up being named after them. So Gaul is what it used to be called. The Franks move in, and it gets called France. The Saxons and Angles go into Britain, teaming up to essentially become the Anglo-Saxons. And then you have the Huns, of course, coming in as well, smashing up this area as well. So what then happens, right? If Rome falls, you have this period of change in Western Europe, which is a really nice way to put it. But these barbarians are migrating into these areas that have been given up by the Romans, and as more barbarians move westward, other tribes are forced to move too. So these groups categorized by their languages, right? And very little else, because to a large extent, that's what we know of them, right? So the Celtic cultures, right? These would be the Gauls, the Britons, and the Bretons. They speak Celtic languages, right? The Germanics, right, because they speak German, right, would be Goths, Franks, Vandals, Saxons, and then the Slavics, right, and they speak Slavic. That'd be the Wends. So you have all these different groups moving around, right? But if you have these massive groups moving around, the order that used to exist under the Roman Empire has fallen to pieces, and so you have widespread violence. So you have these changes in Western Europe, these repeated invasions and constant warfare ends the Western Roman Empire. Rome falls, right? And you have this massive disruption of trade. Merchants are facing invasions from land and sea. Businesses are collapsing. Money is becoming extremely scarce. And you have the downfall of cities, right? Cities are abandoned because where are you going to find most of the money? Where are these roving war bands going to go to try find money, to try to find things to conquer and take? It's going to be the cities. So cities are abandoned and people are moving back out to the countryside. You have this massive population shift. Population is moving away from the cities and they're moving into the countryside to try to make themselves harder to target by these huge war bands. And people are also turning to the church for order and for security, right? If the government has fallen, the Catholic Church is at that point a powerful force across all of these different countries. So Germanic people called the Franks are led by this fellow Clovis, and he ends up converting to Christianity. And the church adapts to the rural conditions of Western Europe, right? The church has built religious communities all over the place called monasteries. And again, here's another map you can see of those barbarian migrations. This one's a bit more detailed than the one we looked at before. And here's another one. And again, I will post this PowerPoint to Classroom. You can take a look at it there. And if you want to take a closer look at these maps, you certainly can. So Constantinople, right? And if we go back, we'll show you on the map, right? Constantinople is right down here, right? Constantinople, which used to be Byzantium, becomes the new capital, and it controls the center for becomes the center for the Roman Empire. So when the western side of the Roman Empire falls, Rome is still there. It's the largest city by population in the world, west of China, of course. Strategic location on trade routes, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago. And it's one of the largest natural harbors in the world. It's linking the east and the west. It's really this bridge between east and west. And the Byzantine gold coin, or the byzant, becomes the main currency of international trade. And they rule provinces by the Roman model. So they have governors, they have the same Roman bureaucracy, an imperial army, heavy taxation. They favor the royal family and priests in trade and taxes. So really using that Roman model. So the Roman Empire hasn't died. It's just moved from Rome. They've abandoned Rome, right? So is it really the Roman Empire anymore, or is it the Byzantine Empire, right? So the Byzantines. And here you can see that Byzantine Empire in the year 814, right, stretching through most of Turkey and into much of Greece. They still hold southern Italy. You can see the Sicily, Sardinia, Crete. So they're a Mediterranean and force, right? They hold Venice and some lands around there. You can really see that empire extending their control over what used to be Rome. Of course, Rome was much bigger. You can see that western part of the Roman Empire has fallen. Carolingian Empire is taken over, right? So expanding influence of the church, right? The Christian church has become an important political, economic, spiritual, and cultural force in Europe. Leading officials in the church are the Pope who's the Pope and the Patriarch. The Patriarch is the leader of the Eastern Church, because the church has split at this point into two sides. Now they've banned heresy, so that means that if you have a belief that contradicts the official religion, you're a heretic. And they also have conversion by force, right? So if people say, well, I'm not going to convert, they can torture you until you do. Now, eventually in the 11th century, the church splits into two independent branches, which is the Eastern Orthodox, based in Constantinople, and the Roman Catholic, based in Rome. But at this point, you have the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, and they haven't split yet. It's not until the 1000s that they do that. And so the church is granted favors by the Roman emperors and kings for land, exemption from taxes, immunity in courts, positions in courts. And in return, the church will endorse kings and secure their rule, right? So kings look to the church to supply educated administrators, right? Where are you going to get people who know how to read and know how to write to help you run your kingdom? Well, the church will provide those. And in return, of course, kings are going to enforce laws that prohibit other religions. So who gets to be king? It's the one the church picks, and that king is going to make sure that the church is the only religion allowed in those countries. So in the 6th century, you can see the Byzantine Empire holds much of what used to be Rome, right? So that'd be about the 500s, and you saw where they were in about 800. So over the next 300 years, they're going to lose a lot of their territories, all of their territories in Spain, all of their territories in Northern Africa, much of their Middle Eastern holdings as well, and much of their holdings here in the Balkans as well. And here you see the Frankish kingdoms. Dark purple is what they held in 768. And Charlemagne, you can see, holds things all the way down into Rome. And then there are the tributary provinces. So these yellow areas are paying tribute to the Frankish kingdoms. And then the Byzantine Empire, you can see, has been pushed all the way down here. So they're really being shoved out. And we're going to talk about what happens there in this massive French empire put together by Constantine. So you have the Carolingians. We were talking about them, right? And they've converted to Christianity. They are Franks, and they are conquering what becomes France, right? Franks, what are we going to name their country? We're going to name it France. So the rise of the aristocratic Charles Martel, right? You can see him here, who dominated the Frankish kingdom in the 8th century. He's a military leader known as Charles the Hammer. And you can use your imagination as to why he's called the Hammer. Probably because he rides around on a horse and bashes people in with a hammer. So he confiscates church lands, then defeats the Umayyad, or the Muslim invasion, at Tours, and his son Pepin the Short continues those church reforms. He establishes this Carolingian dynasty, right? Named to protect the papacy, to establish the Pope and the bishops as the makers of kings. And the greatest legacy of Charles the greatest legacy of this group of people, the Carolingians, is Charles the Great or Charlemagne. And Charlemagne sort of becomes the basis for every noble kingdom in Europe, right? Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was a military general, and he restores Pope Leo III to Rome, he'd been exiled. In return, Leo places a crown on Charlemagne's head and names him the Emperor of the Romans, which secures this relationship between the Frankish kings and the papacy. So Charlemagne has become the first ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, right? So the Western Roman Empire has died. He is now the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Which really eventually becomes Germany. This dynasty is going to last for more than 700 years. Now, Charlemagne imposes order on the empire through the church and also through state, right? So he orders the standardization of Latin. So Latin all has to be the same. Textbooks, manuals for preaching, schools for clergy and people. There's a new form of handwriting. So he puts all of these things in place to try to unite this big empire. And all of this promotes education, it promotes scholars, and it produces a very precise written language, which becomes Latin. Interestingly enough, though, nobody actually speaks Latin. It's only scholars. It's only in books. And so as a result, right, in England, what are they speaking? They're speaking English. In France, they're speaking French. In Spain, they're speaking Spanish. Italy's speaking Italian. The Holy Roman Empire is speaking German. None of these places are actually speaking Latin, but they're all using it. So the priesthood knows how to use it. The bishops know how to use it. Their books are all written in Latin, but nobody's actually speaking the language other than priests at Mass. And here you can see those dynasties, right? And if you look at this map here, these three sections, right, are all part of the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, and it'll split up when he dies. And we'll talk about that momentarily. But before we do that, let's talk about the birth of those modern languages that I was talking about. So those languages start developing in the Middle Ages, right? And these new languages are born through migration, resettlement, conflict, and changes, right? So Old English is this combination of Anglican and Saxon, and it begins to incorporate words borrowed from Latin, from Old French, from Old German, and Old Norse, and actually English starts incorporating words from Arabic as well, right? And so roots of contemporary Spanish, Italian, and French and other Romance languages are seen coming from, the Old Roman Latin, right? And then we have slaves and serfs. Now, slaves are made up of conquered peoples usually. Some are treated harshly, others are treated fairly. Rural slaves become serfs, right? They work the land, they provide labor for the owner in return for some form of protection. And this is where we see feudalism, which is the new form of government that we're going to talk about being set up, right? And feudalism is essentially that, right? Slaves or serfs do not own anything. They work the land, and the land is owned by the local lord, and the local lord in exchange protects those serfs or protects those peasants. So the feudal system gives order and stability. Everybody knows their place. Everybody knows what they have to do. And the manorial system provides for an economy that's based on farming and being self-sufficient on the manor. And we're going to show you, and if you're thinking about what does Europe look like at this point in time, it looks dangerous, right? It is not a safe place. There are roving bands of armies running around all over the place. And so how are you going to protect yourself? And that's where the manorial system comes in. And you can see the base word in there is manor. And so a manor is essentially a castle, right? So feudalism, how does it work? Well, it's this pyramid. If you look over here, you have the king, then you have the tenants in chief, right? They're under the king. Then you have the knights or lords under them, and then the peasants underneath all of that, and they're holding up the whole thing. So increasing violence and lawless countryside, right? When the Roman Empire collapses, nobody's keeping the peace anymore. So you have peasants, right? People who are farming, just trying to live their lives. who turn to strong folks for protection, right? The strong, of course, are going to want something in return for that, and that's where feudalism comes in. It is this relationship between ranked individuals in a chain, right? You have the king who's in charge, his vassals underneath him, the lords underneath them, the knights underneath them, and then the serfs at the very bottom. Feudalism works because of the notion of mutual obligation, right? Voluntary cooperation from serf to noble. A man's word is the cornerstone of their social life. So you have to be honest. You have to be honorable. You swear an oath to someone, and then you fight for them for the rest of your life or their life. So what are our key terms here? Fief is land given by a lord in return for a vassal's military service, an oath of loyalty. So a king who owns all the land would give a fief to some tenants in chief, right, to some of their lords. Serfs are the common peasants who work the lord's land. A tithe is a tax that the serfs pay. Corvée is a condition of unpaid labor by serfs, right? So they have to maintain the roads or ditches or maintain the knight's house or castle because through the corvée. And we'll take a look at this pillar here, or this pyramid here, and then when we're done with this, that'll be where we're at today, and we'll finish up the Middle Ages next week. So at the top, of course, of your feudal system, you have the king, right? And all power and authority flows through the king. Underneath the king, you have the lords, right? They're more powerful servants, and those lords, of course, have lands splitting up the kingdom. Underneath them, you have lesser lords, right? Lower vassals. So the upper lords might be dukes, counts. The lesser lords might be barons or earls. And they'll have smaller chunks of land, right? So each of these major lords probably has several lesser lords who serve them as well. And then underneath them, you have knights, right? And so a knight might not even have a castle. They might just have a manor house with a wooden palisade around the outside instead of actual stone walls. And at the very bottom, you have the peasants and the serfs. So lesser lords can call their knights to come fight for them. Knights, of course, can call their peasants to come fight for them. Lords can call the lesser lords to come fight for them. And the king, of course, can call all of them to come fight for him. So this is how that system works. How do you organize an army? Well, the king does it, right? The king calls the lords, who call the lesser lords, and then the knights, and then the peasants. They all get together, and then they go fight. So what's going up this system? You owe military service up the system. You owe labor up the system, and you owe loyalty as well. So the peasants owe labor and loyalty and military service to their knights. Those knights do the same thing to the lesser lords. The lesser lords, of course, to those lords above them, and then all of them up to the king. So that's what's owed up. But what's owed down? What does the king owe the people underneath him? Well, he owes them land and he owes them protection, right? So the king owes the lords underneath him land. He has to give them land for them to work. He has to give them protection as well. And so you can see how this is mutually tied into each other, right? If a knight owes the lesser lord's military service, and this knight's lands are getting attacked, that lesser lord should call in the other knights and then come to help to protect him. So this is how the feudal system works. And I think that's where we'll stop it this week. Next week is our last week of distance learning, the last week of Q4. We covered a lot less material, I think, than we would have were we in the classroom. But that's the system that we have. So if you have any questions about what you've seen here, feel free to contact me, shoot me an email, meet me in office hours. You know where they are, and I'm going to keep that posted at the top of our Google Classroom. So well done. Good work.